All righty, folks. Welcome, welcome. Up next, we got John Bentich with ACHV Life Sciences. Go, John.
Great, thank you. Before we get going, just want to remind everyone that I will be making forward-looking statements as part of this presentation, so encourage everyone to look at our SEC filings and the risk factors included in those. ACHV Life Sciences focused on the development and ultimately commercialization of a drug called cytisinicline as an aid to smoking cessation and treatment for nicotine addiction. This is a drug that has a rich history. It's one that has been on the market in Eastern Europe for over 20 years. It's treated over 20 million patients over that time frame, but it's a drug that's never been available in the US. So we were able to get exclusive rights and supply to the drug to effectively bring it out of obscurity and first and foremost bring it to the US and then ultimately to the rest of the world. And we have global rights to the asset outside of 17 countries, predominantly in Eastern Europe, where the product is sold today. But in terms of the market, this is quite large, probably goes without saying, but smoking is an addiction that has not gone away. There's over 1 billion smokers around the globe, and it's the leading cause of preventable deaths, with nearly 8 million people dying annually and nearly 500,000 here in the US. We've got 28 million adult smokers in the US, and while we've made huge strides over the last 4 or 5 decades in terms of reducing the number of smokers and the percentage of the population using cigarettes, we've actually seen a net uptick here in recent times, and that's largely driven by the advent of e-cigarettes and vapes. These are products that didn't exist 15 years ago, and we now have 11 million adult users here in the US. And that doesn't account for another 3 to 4 million youth that are using these products that have been, kind of furthered along with products like Juul and Puff Bar and others with the kind of the fruit and candy flavors. So, the category is growing, and we have the ability to address not only the kind of core market of smoking cessation, but also a broader nicotine addiction play with e-cigarettes as well. Now, this category overall has really lacked any new innovation. The last approved product was a product called Chantix, and that was approved in 2006. So it's been almost 2 decades since we've had a new product in the market. And there are no silver bullets here. Even with Chantix, which has been the most efficacious product brought to market, 4 out of 5 patients will have relapsed within 6 months of initiating therapy. And that's in well-controlled studies. I think it's likely much worse in practice. But when you look at this category overall, people will cycle through therapies. The estimates are 8 to 11 quit attempts to ultimately be abstinent long-term. Most smokers have a desire to quit. About half make a quit attempt annually, but the success rate is really quite low in the single digits. So we really do need additional options to help patients here. So why do we think we have a better mousetrap? So, we've got a number of key differentiators. First and foremost is really strong tolerability. We've seen predominantly single-digit rates of adverse events, and that compares very favorably to the products that are on the market today. And those adverse events do lead to lower compliance. We've also seen very robust efficacy now through our clinical development program. We look to have best-in-class efficacy when we look at it from an odds ratio perspective, and I'll walk through some of that data here today. We've also validated a shorter course of therapy at 6 weeks. So the products on the market today are all at 12 weeks in duration. So having something that's half that duration at 6 weeks gives patients another option in the event that they don't want to commit to 3 months of therapy, but with the ability to extend out to 3 months if they do need a little bit more assistance during their quit journey. We also have the benefit of having in-market experience. I mentioned this product has been on the market for over 20 years in Eastern Europe. There's not a lot of late-stage assets that have that sort of history behind them, and we think that's a real advantage. We haven't seen, again, any unusual safety signals, things like that, over these 20-plus years, where products in the market today, Chantix in particular, 3 years after its approval, it got slapped with a box warning for suicidal ideations. So I think having that in-market experience is really critical as we move this ahead. Also, the product's naturally derived. Historically, we've been sourcing the drug from the seeds of the laburnum tree, and we continue to hear from patients as well as subjects in our trials that that's an attractive element to the product as well. Now, when we look at the overall smoking cessation landscape, I mentioned Chantix, but we've got a couple of other products in this category as well. And we like to plot this on a tolerability and efficacy scale just to kind of lay the products out. So Chantix has been the most efficacious product brought to market, but it also comes with some of the poorest tolerability. I mentioned the box warning. We'll go through some of the other AEs here shortly. At the other end of the spectrum, you have your nicotine replacement therapies. So your gums, patches, lozenges, effectively nicotine in another form. So tolerability is great, but leaves a lot to be desired on the efficacy front. Now, there's one other oral therapeutic, and that's bupropion, also known as Wellbutrin. It's a repurposed depression drug. It brings a bit of the worst of both, so poorer tolerability, as well as lower efficacy. So we think cytisinicline fills a segment of the market that frankly doesn't exist today, and that's combining strong tolerability with strong efficacy. And we think in this category in particular, that will really resonate. Now, Chantix has been the most successful product brought to market. It achieved over $1 billion in peak sales before it was withdrawn from the market. They found a potential carcinogen in the drug product, so it was removed just prior to going generic. But at this stage, all the products on the market are generic. So from a commercial opportunity standpoint, we would likely be the only voice out on the street marketing a new branded product. And we think that's a real advantage as we drive this ahead. And even though Chantix hit over $1 billion at peak sales, now that it's generic and even at significant discounts, the first generic entrant did $300 million of sales within the first 12 months. And recent IQVIA data suggests the generic market is around $450 million for that product, again, without any promotion and with a fairly disliked product overall. So there's a real opportunity to come in and take substantial market share and even grow the market. And so when we look at Chantix in particular, again, the most efficacious product, and when we look at those folks who are making quit attempts annually, it only penetrated about 4% of that market. So we asked ourselves, why didn't it do better than that? Is it because of access? Patients just couldn't get access to the drug? Well, that's not the case. The Affordable Care Act mandates that all FDA-approved smoking cessation products be covered. So when we looked at the script data, we saw nearly 80% of Chantix scripts were being delivered with no copay. So access is not an issue here. But what we also saw in the script data is a high degree of non-compliance. So with Chantix, only about 50% of patients would fill the second month of therapy, and less than 25% would fill the third month. And the number one reason given for that was tolerability. So again, a product that does come with better tolerability, we believe will lead to better compliance and ultimately better outcomes for patients. So I want to talk a little bit about how the drug works. So cytisinicline specifically targets the nicotine receptors in the brain. There's a specific receptor called alpha-4 beta-2, and it works as a partial agonist antagonist. So what that means is, in one sense, the molecule comes in and it blocks the receptor. So if you continue to use nicotine products, the nicotine can't get in, so you don't get the same pleasure and satisfaction that you normally would. But at high concentrations, it also partially stimulates the receptors. So you do get a little bit of the buzz associated with nicotine, albeit at significantly lower levels. But that helps with the cravings and withdrawal symptoms as you're going through a quit attempt. And this mechanism is actually validated. So Pfizer actually developed Chantix after our product, but they created effectively a synthetic analog to ours. But when they did that, they created what I call a dirty molecule that has off-target effects that lead to some of the adverse event profile. So what we do here is just compare, what do we look like compared to Chantix in their label. And so one of the well-documented receptors is 5-HT3, which is a receptor, when you agonize it, it induces nausea and vomiting. So when we look at the label of Chantix, there's a 28% rate of nausea. typically happens in the first couple weeks of therapy, which is why on Chantix you start with a half a dose and you slowly titrate up. Historically for us, we started with a high dose and titrated down, yet we've seen single-digit rates of nausea. With Chantix, if you make it through the initial wave, there's elevated levels of insomnia, abnormal dreams, as well as headaches. So again, for this category, we think this is really critical. This is not oncology where a patient is willing to put themselves through just about anything to survive. This is more elective. Frankly, people like to smoke, they like to vape, and if you feel awful on the medication, it's very easy just to give up and go back to what you were doing before. We also did have a head-to-head trial directly against Chantix. This was done by an investigator down in New Zealand. And what they found was statistically lower rates of adverse events. It was about half the number for cytisinicline compared to Chantix or varenicline. And it was across every single reported category. So something that we'd seen comparing across trials, but to see it in the same setting reinforced what we believe to be true here. Now on the efficacy side, I mentioned we look to be best in class in terms of odds ratios. And so, it's always difficult to compare across trials, but the Cochrane group out of the UK that does independent meta-analyses has done a lot of work in this category. And so the portion here in blue on the left is work that they've done. So we look at the options available on the market today. Nicotine replacement therapy and bupropion have odds ratios of roughly 2. So what that means is on those products, you're 2 times more likely to quit than those folks who tried placebo. Chantix or varenicline, the most efficacious product, odds ratio of roughly 3. And what we've now seen in our development program is odds ratios between 4 and 6, which is really unprecedented in this category. And what I'd consider now 2 decades later, a more refractory group of smokers who have tried and failed and tried and failed multiple occasions. So to see success here, I think is really important. So I want to shift now and talk a little bit about the development program that we put together over the last 5 or so years. We've deemed this the ORCA program. And the first trial we ran was called ORCA 1, which was really to hone in on the appropriate dose and administration to move forward into phase 3 development. This was the first trial that we ever ran in the U.S. and the first time we combined behavioral counseling along with the drug, which we know is very synergistic. But we looked at 4 different active arms against matched placebo. We did 2 on a downward titration schedule. This is what's being used in Europe today at a low and a high dose. And then we looked at a more simplified dosing of 3 times a day, again at a low and a high dose. You had to be smoking at least 10 cigarettes per day to be allowed into the study. And this was run across, I think, just under 10 centers across the U.S. If you look at the demographics here, these were pack-a-day smokers, been smoking for more than 30 years, had tried between 4 and 5 times to quit previously. And we list out the previous treatments here. You can see they really kind of run the gamut of everything that's available. So all of the products, including e-cigarettes, yet everyone is still smoking, still looking for solutions to quit. So pretty indicative of what I would anticipate to see commercially as well here in the U.S. And what we found out of this trial was that the higher 3 milligram dosage dosed on the flat 3 times a day was the most efficacious arm of the bunch. And at the end of 25 days of treatment, we saw 50% of patients had quit compared to only 10% on placebo, highly statistically significant. And I think importantly, we saw this effect size maintained over a subsequent 4-week period. And that is effectively the FDA approvable endpoint, which is 4 consecutive weeks of not a single cigarette. And that has to be biochemically verified, which is the gold standard in this case, which is a 2-part test. Patient will self-report if they've had any cigarettes, and then you do an expired carbon monoxide test, and they have to be below 10 parts per million. And you have to pass both of those to be deemed abstinent. So very, very strong result. This is what we ended up taking forward into our phase 3 program. We also made one additional shift, and that was to extend the dosing from 25 days out to 6 and 12 weeks. And this was really to put our best foot forward in terms of the headline efficacy. and be able to measure the FDA approvable endpoint, that 4 consecutive weeks of not a single cigarette, while patients were still on the medication. So with 25 days, some if not all of that measurement would have to be post-therapy. And we know that quit rates are never higher than when you're on drug. Once you remove it, there is a natural relapse rate over time. The drug can only get you so far, and then, kind of natural factors will kick in beyond. So what we designed was ORCA-2 and ORCA-3, 2 identical phase 3 designs. These were run across 30 different centers. And we had 3-arm trial. Arm A was placebo. Arm B was 6 weeks of cytisinicline followed by 6 weeks of placebo. And then Arm C was effectively 12 weeks of therapy. And then we tracked patients out to 6 months post-randomization into the study. Again, similar to our ORCA-1 trial, we combined full behavioral counseling, and you had to be smoking at least 10 cigarettes per day to be entered into the trial. And in this case, we were looking at that 4-week continuous abstinent rate during the last 4 weeks of therapy of each of the active arms compared to the placebo arm as the primary endpoint. Now, demographics-wise, very similar to what we saw in our phase 2 trial. Pack-a-day smokers, mid-50s, duration of smoking even longer in this case, between 36 and 38 years, and again, a median number of quit attempts of 4. We don't show it here, but again, the prior therapy is very similar to what we saw previously. And what we found was, highly replicated results. We show here the 12-week results. We saw between 30 and roughly 33% quit rates during the last 4 weeks of therapy, so weeks 9 through 12, compared to, again, less than 10% on placebo. Odds ratios between 4 and 6, highly statistically significant. And again, importantly, we saw that effect size maintained all the way out to 6 months. When we compare this in terms of quit rates directly to Chantix, they, along with GSK and a couple of others, ran a large trial to help disprove the suicidality issue. In that trial for U.S. patients, weeks 9 through 24, so the panel here on the right, for U.S. patients, they showed quit rates of roughly 16%. We were north of 20, so again, getting to higher absolute quit rates and significantly better odds ratios. So great overall result for us in terms of the 12-week arm. 6 weeks also validated, statistically significant, a little bit more variability here because the hurdle is significantly harder. We started measuring efficacy from week 3 all the way through week 24, where in the 12-week arm, you had 8 weeks of grace period. Nonetheless, 6 weeks validated, again, gives subjects or patients another option for that shorter course. So from a commercial perspective, a doc would write a 90-day script. Patient would fill the first 6 weeks. If they've quit at the end of that, that's great. They can move on. If they need a little bit more time to get there, then they just refill an incremental 6 weeks and get the full 3 months of therapy. Now, I think if something were to have gone wrong with the phase 3s, it would have been on safety and tolerability. We doubled the dosage and we tripled the duration of therapy, yet we continue to see predominantly single-digit rates of adverse events. The only thing that crept into the double digits was a bit of insomnia, just barely over 10%. But you can also see things like nausea. In some cases, we had higher rates of nausea in the placebo arm, yet we were getting 4 to 6 times more patients quitting. And if you look at most of these, insomnia, nausea, headache, these are traditionally associated with withdrawal symptoms. So you'd expect more of those in our arm. So overall, great result. We didn't see any treatment-related serious adverse events. Again, it continues to be very clean from a safety profile. So where do we go from here? Well, we had a meeting with FDA beginning of this year for the final piece of the puzzle to drive this ahead, and that's an open label safety exposure trial. We're going to be bringing back subjects from our prior studies and treating them for up to 12 weeks to get some long-term exposure data. And this is because the FDA views this as a chronic relapsing condition where a patient may get this multiple times over the course of their life. And this will be the final piece that will allow us to initiate a new drug application filing, which we're anticipating first half of 2025. So this study is initiating this quarter, and we'll be looking to fully enroll it this year and use this data to help initiate that NDA filing in 2025. Now, I mentioned e-cigarettes earlier. This is a completely untapped market. Mentioned all the products for smoking cessation on the market today are all generic. So nobody is looking into this. So we see this as a commercial opportunity that we could wholly own, and not just be an aid to smoking cessation, but a treatment for nicotine addiction more broadly. And we think that would really set this product apart from what's been brought to market to date. So an area that we've been very excited about getting involved in. We were fortunate enough to partner with NIDA and the NIH to run the first ever double-blind placebo-controlled study in this setting. This was called ORCA V1, run across 5 centers in the U.S. We randomized 160 subjects on a 2-to-1 randomization, active to placebo, treated for 12 weeks as a proof of concept to see if we could get activity here. Now, given the mechanism of action, we should have applicability in any form of nicotine addiction. But nonetheless, you've got to run the experiment and see what you get. So what we found was, even with a small 160 subject trial, we saw statistically significant results, again, on what would be the FDA approvable endpoint, 32% biochemically confirmed quit rate during weeks 9 through 12, compared to 15% on placebo, odds ratio of just over 2.6, and really gives us a foothold to drive this program forward and open this up on a broader scale. So we're planning on holding an end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA to agree on next steps for this indication. We believe it would be a single phase 3 trial that would allow us to open this up, and that ORCA V1 would be one of 2 well-controlled studies for approval, and then we'd leverage all our data from the smoking indication. So with that meeting, we expect to take place second half of this year, and we'll chart the course forward for vaping. So overall, we've done 3 well-controlled studies, actually 4 when you include vaping, and we're in the final throes with the open label trial that will allow us to move forward with a new drug application first half of next year, and chart the course forward to an approval first half of 2026. We've got strong product protection across a number of patent families, the most important of which has been issued in the U.S., and that's on our current dose and administration. That goes out through 2040. In addition, we'll get 5 years of exclusivity under Hatch-Waxman, plus another 30-month stay on generics for having an Orange Book listed patent. And then in addition, we see some protection from the supply chain, given it's naturally derived. To date, it's not been able to be made synthetically, so that's something we continue to aspire to find a way to make it. So we think supply is another barrier to potential generics moving forward in this category. Just to close, we've got very strong cash balance. We ended up announcing $124 million financing in February of this year, of which $60 million was funded at close. So on a pro forma basis, we had north of $71 million of cash at the end of the year. And we've got another $64 million in milestone warrants that would be available within 30 days after NDA acceptance, which would be in 2025. So we're solidly funded through the end of next year with the cash we have on hand today, with the ability to be funded all the way through approval with those warrants being exercised. And we've got a team that's done it before. Our co-founders, Rick Stewart was the founder of Ameren Corporation. When he and Tony Clark, our other co-founder, left, they went out looking for under-the-radar, unloved assets, which is where they found cytisinicline. But in addition, they found 2 other drugs that are now on the market. One they sold to BioMarin that's now in the hands of Catalyst Pharmaceuticals. It's a drug called Firdapse for a rare autoimmune disease. And they also found another drug in Belgium that they licensed for 1,000 euros, sold to Zogenix for nearly 140 million a couple of years later. And that's a drug called Fintepla that Zogenix was bought by UCB a little over a year ago for just under $2 billion. All of those products are doing roughly 300 million of sales. We see this as a $1 billion opportunity, and frankly has more potential than anything we've had an opportunity to work on to date. So with that, we think we're well positioned to address what continues to be a global public health epidemic. We've got a team that's done it before, really poised to move this forward and get an NDA on file in the U.S. first half of next year. And we've got the capital on hand to go execute on the plan. So appreciate everyone's time today, and hope you're enjoying the conference, and look forward to providing updates as we proceed. Sure, questions? Yeah, the question is, this is going to be over-the-counter or prescription medication, and for us, this would be a prescription medication. I think over time, given the safety and tolerability profile we have, there's potential for this to move over the counter, but we think RX is the right place to start. Yeah, so the question is around, is smoking on the decline around the globe? And the answer is no. It's actually been fairly flat, around 1 billion to 1.1 billion smokers. And while we've made strides in the U.S. and certain countries, I think a lot of the third world parts of the world have actually seen increases. And I think now with the advent of the e-cigarettes, we're starting to unwind some of the successes we've had, here in North America and Europe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is around the nicotine pouches and others and how those impact the market going forward. So I think for us, we don't see that as being competitive. I think folks that are using those, it's still, I think there's 3 to 4 million here in the U.S., compared to 11 million vapors and 28 million smokers. I think there's some limit. It's probably predominantly male, though we do see some female probably in the Nordic areas. And I think over time, it is an addiction. It's costly. People are going to look for ways to quit kind of any form of nicotine. And we think that's actually an area we could address down the road. But given its kind of smaller sizing, it's one that we're not going after like we are with vaping at the moment. But I don't see it as really, having a big impact on the overall addressable market for us. Yeah, so the question is on the open label trials. That's something we knew going into this year we'd need, and no, that was a surprise. We had a pre-NDA meeting with the FDA last fall, and it was the first time they raised longer-term data beyond 12 weeks with us. And so we were able to get clarity. We looked for other paths to move this forward without having to do that, perhaps doing this as a phase 4 commitment. And I think, unfortunately, it was a policy decision that FDA wanted this data on hand for review of the NDA. And I think it's in part driven by their experience with Chantix and having to put a box warning on that product after it was approved. And they know this is a drug that's going to be used by millions of patients on the other side of approval. So I think they're just erring on the side of caution. Yeah, we basically used the FDA clarity to help catalyze a financing. So, we got the clarity and we had the funding to go execute on the plan. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, how is it delivered? Yes, it's a pill. Oral tablet taken with or without food 3 times a day. I think we get asked sometimes, wouldn't it be better as a single tablet or twice a day? Certainly, but this is not a chronic indication where you're asking someone to take this for years on end. And these are folks that have been doing something 20 times a day for 30 plus years. They are acutely aware of what's going on during a quit attempt. So we've seen greater than 90% compliance. We don't think that's going to be an issue at all. Yeah. Well, great. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.